So a very warm welcome to everyone. We have 4 exciting guests here, and Robin, Celikates and I are hosting this event as the directors of the center. So what was the idea behind this roundtable, the convergence of social struggles? In order to preserve or even expand the welfare state, migration must be stopped. Claims like these accompanied the turn of former leftists to the racist and nationalist far-right camp in the last decade. Underlying such considerations is a view of society in which the misery of some can only be eliminated by exacerbating the misery of others. The counter-thesis is that democratic co-determination, especially in the economic sphere, can only be expanded if co-determination means explicitly standing up for migration and against racism in an internationalist and solidaristic way. Shouldn't an emancipatory left be able to criticize right-wing populism and neoliberalism and to fight for a different society without playing off anti-racism or anti-sexism on the one hand and social equality or justice against each other, and without playing off the ecological crisis against the so-called social question? This thesis is based on an image of society in which forms of oppression, exploitation, and domination are interconnected, so that the struggle against one of these forms must strive to overcome all forms of oppression, exploitation, and domination. But is there such a thing as a central origin of the relations of exploitation, oppression, and domination in society? Is it possible to step into the heart of the beast, so to say? Or should we look for bottom-up ways to articulate communalities as well as differences between social movements? With our guests, we want to talk about the actual tendencies and the actual experiences that indicate that social struggles have a common direction, as well as about the dynamics and blockages that prevent such a convergence. We are very happy to have you here, and Robin is now going to introduce our guests.
Thanks, Rahel, and a very warm welcome also from my side. We really have a wonderful lineup of panelists for today's discussion, which I'm very excited about. So let me just very briefly introduce them. If you don't know them yet, you will certainly quickly get to know them tonight. Amna Akbar is Associate Professor for Law at Ohio State University. Her work is studying the intersections of radical social movements and the law, of policing, race, and inequality. And of specific relevance for our discussions tonight is a recent set of articles she published on abolitionism, on the radical uses that social movements can make of the law, and on the idea of non-reformist reforms. They appeared in the New York Times and other very prominent outlets. Welcome, Amna, very glad you can join us today. We have Manon Garcia, who is currently Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. And I say currently because I'm extremely happy to announce that she will soon be coming to Berlin, in fact, to join the philosophy department at the FU. And of special relevance for our discussion tonight is her recent book, We Are Not Born Submissive: How Patriarchy Shapes Women's Lives, which provides a feminist analysis of the role of submission and consent in the reproduction of relations of domination. Welcome, Manon. Romin Khan is a social scientist and senior advisor for anti-racism and the politics of migration at the trade union Verdi, which is actually the second largest German trade union. And we are very happy that you're here with us tonight because we think that your analytical and practical perspective on the intersection of labor struggles, trade unions, and anti-racist organizing is obviously highly relevant for our topic tonight. Welcome, Romin. And finally, Silke van Dyk is Professor of Political Sociology at Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. Her work looks at the intersection of capitalism, authoritarianism, and the welfare state. And of special relevance for us tonight are her recent articles on right-wing populism, also within academia, so-called identity politics, and the relation between class, gender, and race in emancipatory politics. Welcome, Silke. And with that, back over to Rahel.
Thank you so much, Robin, and again, welcome to all of you. I'm really excited about having this panel with you in the discussion. So the first round and the first question that we want to discuss is, I mean, as I've already mentioned, the crises of today seem to be manifold, and the social movements are manifold too. The social movements that, as we like to put it, turn those crises in. So there are struggles over affordable housing, struggles about climate change, police violence, freedom of movement. There are also feminist struggles and the demands for workplace democracy, which are gaining momentum in the last years. So to start off with our debate, do you see a convergence of all these heterogeneous movements now or in the near future? And what about the possible conflicts between these movements when, for example, the transformation costs of climate change politics burden the poor? So Amna, what do you think?
Thanks, Rahel, and thanks, Robin. So in terms of the question of the convergence between today's social struggles, I think the question, or the answer rather, depends on some sense on the level of abstraction or focus that you're going to take as to the particular struggles. Of course, we're living in a moment, as your introduction suggested, of crisis for neoliberal capitalism. In the United States, the political class is kind of closing ranks around a post-pandemic normalcy to kind of suspend this period of disruption, the sense that there are alternate political, economic, social possibilities through the door that we might build or walk through. And of course, in the United States, as around the world, there is a right wing composed of an increasingly diverse set of forces that mobilizes, as it has for a long time, racial tropes of various sorts to mobilize criminalization of rebellion from below, to target specifically in the US teachers as a both striking force of labor and their teaching of race and the histories of the United States. And that right wing too is using protest, direct action, and violent tactics to kind of articulate itself, and it has a proximity with the police forces that the left is kind of in opposition to. On the left in the United States, across social movement organizations, by and large, you have this kind of contradiction where on the one hand, you continue to hear an insistence on kind of burning it down and abolition, right? So kind of these calls to burn down the structures that live around us, to abolish them altogether. And at the same time, an embrace of essentially reform or legislative struggles. And of course, on the left, people are articulating kind of a different approach to the question of reform, articulating frameworks for non-reformist reforms. But at the same time, nonetheless, across kind of movement formations, whether you're talking about the Democratic Socialists of America, Critical Resistance, the Movement for Black Lives, the Sunrise Movement, you have an engagement with kind of the nitty-gritty politics of legislation, city, state, and federal politics. And in the United States, I mean, I think this might be one thing that'd be interesting to discuss in this kind of transnational grouping. I think we tend to not have as dynamic a sense of the relationship between street and electoral politics, and they're kind of seen to be at odds with one another on the US left. And so across kind of these formations, you have this embrace of legislative politics and this kind of hesitation about it. You have a kind of critique that you can see convergences around about too much policing, prisons, and military spending, too much wealth inequality, a kind of anti-capitalist critique around people that the state should be doing more to have people's basic needs met around questions of housing and food, for example, that workers should have more power, that the histories of capitalism and colonialism should inform, both inform the world around us and should inform the kind of battles that we're waging. And then, as you both said, the question of environmental disaster, which is related to the questions of land and housing as well, are very much at the center. And so you have a convergence around these sets of critiques around capitalism, colonialism, race, and gender. And then you have kind of articulations of various positive projects emphasized in different ways. So abolition democracy, democratic socialism, a general politics of kind of redistribution, and an emphasis on kind of the question and the building of different kinds of infrastructure, both for the state and for movement. So you have campaigns against jail infrastructure, for example, the Green New Deal in the United States. Now we have the Green New Deals for housing and public schools, which are also about building kind of different kinds of infrastructure. And at the same time, you have mutual aid being at the center of what movements are building, mutual aid in the face of disaster. So around basic needs being met, like food and rent, and in the form of things like bailouts for people who are behind bars and can't kind of bail themselves out, and strike funds. And you have kind of at the same time, kind of alongside the politics of mutual aid, a resurgence of anarchist politics, which I think are also interesting in relation to this question of the state. So you have a lot of big questions kind of floating around about the institutional forms of the state or not the state, of social movement organizations, and kind of the way that the left should organize itself to kind of generate real concessions from the state and build the kind of world that we want to live in. And within that, there are a number of debates and ideological kind of range of politics being expressed.
Thank you so much. So Manon, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amna, for the for your analysis. So I want to. I don't really know where I'm responding from. I guess as a philosopher, as a feminist philosopher, what I found very exciting lately is the fact that intersectional analysis seems to me to become really a consensus among most people. But so I'd say my source of optimism is to say feminist philosophers, most of them today, are convinced by the importance of intersectional analysis, and I feel like there's an interest in trying to revisit what has been called second wave feminism through the lens of all the failures of second wave feminism that have been manifested by the third wave, and so mostly by Black and Indigenous women. And I found this to be very exciting. At the same time, as a French person and as a person living on an American campus, I am very worried by what looks like a sort of fragmentation of a certain left. In France, it's very striking how first what they've called Islamo-leftism has created a big drift in France with this idea that intersectional intellectuals, like a lot of French people of color, but also academics like me, were accused of being pro-Islamism out of being anti the French French imperialism, let's say. And now there is this whole moral panic about wokeism, and I'm very worried of what it creates. Some of you may have heard of this, but there was a very appalling situation on Harvard campus a few days ago where this professor was accused of sexual harassment, and some of the most important professors in African American studies and anthropology wrote a letter in support of him. And the only way I can explain why these very distinguished people, very respectable people, wrote a letter saying, it's our friend John, he can't be a bad guy, is that they're deeply convinced that there is something going on like cancel culture, wokeism, that prevents that is such that these people that are leftists in their work, that are analysts of power, etc., end up siding with the institutions, siding with the people who have power. And so I'm worried about what is going on that creates a fragmentation of people who, at least in their scholarship, seem to have a convergence of views about social justice and about the importance of struggle against different forms of oppression. And in a more concrete way, it's very striking what's going on right now because the French election is coming up, presidential election, and the left is completely fragmented at a time where really the current president is talking about destroying the public service for education. They destroyed the public service for retirement. So it's really bad what is going on, especially for poor people in France. And the left is completely falling apart. And the head of the Communist Party has decided recently to adopt a campaign line that is to say, I defend the poor people who are not about ecology, but who want to eat good meat and have good barbecues with their friends, because we're not about poor people don't worry about gender, race, and ecology. What they want is having barbecues with their friends. And so this sort of idea of pitting against each other ecological concerns and class seems to me completely false, because if poor people were not poor, they would probably eat good things, and so but this whole idea that what it is to be a poor French person is to want to eat meat, and of course the extreme right is so happy because right behind that you have this idea of Muslims who don't eat pork and who don't respect the French cuisine. And so now there are absurd debates between the Green Party and the Communist Party about what is a French dish? Is couscous a French dish? And can couscous not have meat? And so I'm very worried about this, because I think it looks like it's funny, but it's actually not funny at all. And I feel like so many people who are oppressed on only one line of oppression are terrified with intersectionality, because it tells them that it's not that bad what they're going through, and that it could be worse, something like that, or at least that's what they perceive. That, this whole idea of white feminists who are scared of realizing that they're actually rich and not oppressed on race side. And so I intersectionality both makes me very optimistic theoretically, and in practice I'm also very concerned by how this moral panic of cancel culture, wokeism, etc. contributes to creating huge divides to an extent that the political landscape is not very recognizable anymore.
Yeah, thank you so much. Romin, in your work, I think, this tendency that Manon's so worried about, to play off those issues against each other, the ecological question as against the social question, and also the question whether racism, what role racism plays within our society and how it should be addressed. So what is your take on it? Manon just ended on a very pessimistic note concerning the conflicts, or at least the strategies from, let's say, the other side to play those conflicts out against each other. What do you think about it? What is your take on the matter of convergence as against conflict?
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. and I'm trying to contribute as good as I can from like a organization which is probably, or institution which is probably very stable in a way, despite all these public proxy wars being fought right now. Like so in that sense, I'm sometimes quite surprised that we have this media war going on, and a lot of, and you feel like, okay, this is like the main battlefield right now. And I think what Manon said at the end, this is also something which I'm also fearing, that the whole political or the political landscape will be totally different after this war has been probably fought. But at the same time, and I think that has to be taken into consideration. At the same time, we still have like organizations, probably like, for example, unions, who are where these kind of I don't know how this kind of debates are being fought all the time, and they are probably kind of a lab. Or my understanding, they could be a kind of a lab for to deal with these issues in a different way, and not as contradictions between different positions, but rather working in the same directions from a common ground. And the common ground, I think, is the social question for us. And in the social question, there are definitely many things are playing into this field. Like, for example, in my work, the question of I just looked it up. The word is disfranchisement, like people who don't have the right to work, to vote. Excuse me. This, for example, this group is becoming bigger and bigger in Germany, like with a lot of migrants who came to Germany in the last years. I don't have the right to vote, and this, for example, is something where it has to be it has to be addressed, which we are addressing not as strong as it should be, for example. But I think in that sense, people realize, okay, my further colleague don't have the right to vote, and I do have the right, and there is something I don't gain anything from when he's kind of disfranchised at this point, and when he don't have the right to vote. So I think it's always a question of how you deal with the issues, how big you make these kind of cancel culture, wokeism type of thing. I think 98% of the Germans still don't know what the term woke actually means, but everyone is talking about it in the media. Even like the politicians are now are using it, like right-wing politicians, like from probably the Conservative Party. And sometimes I'm more like kind of, we should relax on certain issues, probably, if it's still possible. Probably it's a different situation to the one in the US. But we shouldn't like kind of make it bigger in a sense, but rather try to keep in mind that this intersectional approach has already won in many regards, and now we have to keep on from this and work on it and put it on a broader basis. Also talk about probably new issues who are coming up, which are old issues basically, but now is probably the time to speak about it. And in that sense, I can, this is like my contribution. I'm more like kind of, sometimes I think, okay, we should be more outspoken on these kind of issues, and sometimes I'm more like kind of, I'm quite glad that I don't have to deal with it on a daily basis, because I'm not working on campus, and there are not these battles are fought every day, because people have already kind of, there is a consensus on certain issues.
Yeah. I mean, this is a really interesting perspective, that I mean, all those things are also somehow made up by the media in some way, and made up, I mean, within certain circles. So Silke, you have intervened again and again in those debates, saying that even the attempt to distinguish between the so-called identity politics and the real social questions is somehow is misleading. What is your take on, what do you think of the situation today? Convergence and or conflict between those issues and actually the respective social movements that we are experiencing?
I'm not sure whether or not the high time of this discussion is a little bit over, and I think that's due to the pandemic too, that there were different discussions. I would like to start with this and then come back to the identity politics and class situation, because when I heard the question first for the convergence of struggles, my first impression was it's difficult to answer that, because from a German perspective at the moment it's not a high time of progressive social struggles. So my question would be rather, where are the struggles that could converge then? And I think it's not just the pandemic and the measures against it and the politics of distance, but of course it's important. We saw it with Fridays for Future, which was very vibrant before the pandemic. But I think with Fridays for Future and the pandemic, we had a situation where the left was very much like listen to the science in both camps. And I think, against the background of left-wing movements, this is kind of problematic, that there was a very strong focus that progressive movements have to follow the science. I think that would be one topic interesting to discuss about. And coming back to the question about identity and class politics, I think it is a major problem for left-wing movements that other actors have been quite successful to frame fights against oppression as an elitist project. And I'm not sure whether or not this is just a media phenomenon. I would agree with Romin that there are many circles in the country where these discussions don't hit the ground. But I think the idea that fights against discrimination are like hobbies or of privileged academic people who have to decide to discuss a little bit about racism and sexism, this is very dominant, and I think that's a problem. And from my opinion, left-wing or progressive movement have not been very good at answering that, at deconstructing this reproach that this politic is a politics of privileged people. So I think that would be very important to discuss. Why is this framing so influential against all evidence, and even influential in parts of the academic debate? And for me, that was very interesting when there was this debate that the new right-wing voters, they are kind of workers fighting for their class interests, okay, on the wrong camp, on the right side, but their genuine interest is okay. And this position is very prominent and really against all empirical evidence. And I think we have to take it seriously why it is so why it is surviving. I think that's a huge discussion. And I think there is one weakness within progressive or leftist movements and within progressive academic debates, and that is that we cannot deny that the answers on the social questions are answers within national states. Welfare states are organized within nation states. And so we have to discuss the social question with a transnational perspective. And I don't see here very lively or vibrant debates how we can reinvent the social question beyond welfare states, but not with deregulation and destruction of welfare states, but with an emancipatory perspective to further develop them in another perspective. And I have to be honest, I don't have an answer on that. We don't have a global dimension on or global perspective on social rights. And I think if we don't find answers on that, we will have this cleavage between those who fear that they lose their rights within the privileged nation states of the global north and those fighting against their suppression in other parts of the world. For me, it's one of the hugest challenges.
Maybe to just start off from that, so I guess one way in order to argue that the struggles against oppression are not just, either hobbies of privileged academics or just of this or that group with their particular interests, is to argue that let's say the systems of oppression in question, that they are sort of interlocking or connected, and that they are structural in the sense that they just don't work in the way that they just affect, for example, people who have an ecological sensitivity or something like that. From the work of all of you, I got the impression that this focus on the structural dimension of power, or of domination, of oppression, whatever you want to call it, is quite important to get both the diagnosis right and also to think about the right kind of transformation, or to think about what the aim of emancipatory struggles should actually be and which way these struggles should take. Because there's enough other approaches which still focus either on individual groups or even on the individual, and say, it's a question of, I don't know, in the case of racism, individual attitudes and biases, and we have to, make people aware of their privilege, give them anti-bias training, and then maybe that will help. There are similar individualizing or psychologizing diagnosis of other forms of oppression. So I would just like to know whether we can, how do you understand the structures in question more precisely? Are they ultimately, because Silke, you pointed to the transnational dimension, are they ultimately structures of global capitalism? Are they always in the context of nation states so mediated through the political, legal, institutional structures that this is the level at which the struggles should be pitched? So institutional reform? Are these structures that operate at the level of social norms and enforced traditions? All of the above in some kind of combination. And this is, I guess, not although it sounds quite abstract and academic. It seems like a eminently practical question, because depending on that analysis, the way in which emancipatory struggles proceed, by demanding rights, by organizing anti-bias workshops, by trying to organize anti-capitalist revolutionary movements, by engaging in non-reformist reforms, maybe these ways would suggest themselves depending on the analysis. So yeah, could you say something about both the diagnosis? What structures are we talking about when we're talking about the need to struggle against oppression on a kind of structural level? And what, let's say, form should that struggle take, depending on whether we situate these structures at the level of global capitalism, at the level of the institutional and legal structures of the nation states in question, or more at the cultural and social level of oppressive norms that get reproduced. Can we start with you, Silke, this time to
Okay, you raised really huge questions. To start very basically, I think with regard to the structural dimension, we do live in a social system that externalizes its cost of reproduction. So the capitalist system depends on the reproduction of labor and life through unpaid and low-paid, highly exploited work. And I think that's a very important basic structure to understand why exploitation and discrimination and oppression are so interlinked. I think the other form of exploitation, externalization, of course, is the exploitation of nature without paying for it. So we have the climate and the nature dimension here too. And I think it would be much, the debate would profit if these perspectives of double externalization of unpaid labor and nature would be more in the forefront of the debate, because from this perspective, we can definitely say, demonstrate how sexism and racism are are tools in order to appropriate unpaid or low-paid labor. I think that's one very important point, to say that struggles against sexist and racist oppression have always a materialist dimension, have always been struggles against exploitation. And I think that's a very interesting topic for the discussion. Why people are so successful in denying this materialist dimension of struggles against sexism and racism. I think it was Ta-Nehisi Coates when he wrote a post in the debates on Donald Trump and the Rust Belt workers. He raised the question: only the white guys always have economic problems and all the others only have feelings. And I think that's an interesting point to discuss, this dematerialization of anti-discriminatory politics as a question of hegemony, to define who has true economic and materialist interests. I think that's a very important point. I think another point on the structural basis, on this link of exploitation and discrimination is, I think it is not necessarily, for example, women who have to provide the unpaid labor. We could think of functional equivalence. So there is no, I think there could be liberation movements who liberate some parts of the population from this kind of population, but others would have to step in. And I think that's a dynamic we can observe in the countries of the global north, that sometimes migrant labor substitutes for unpaid female labor of the past. So I think with externalization in these two dimensions, we would grasp some of the very fundamental structural dimensions.
Yeah, thank you. I guess this last dynamic, Romin, is also on your mind. I mean, how migrant labor is changing, let's say, the dynamic of these structures of oppression, exploitation in the when it comes to class and labor. So if you talk to that a bit, I think that would be great. And also, I was just wondering how, from the perspective of a union, this question of structural change appears today. I mean, there's the kind of classic radical prejudice towards unions that they are essentially reformist, right? And that they, in the end, in a kind of trade unionist way, just, sort of struggle for a slightly better situation within the status quo. But I guess that's a prejudice to a certain extent. So if you could talk to these 2 points, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe to take up the last point, it's difficult to answer because I think we work in different fields. Like we have parts of the economy where there is a class war, probably like an open class war going on. If you look at Amazon or these kind of like international companies who don't take respect the workforce and the union drive to establish like a collective agreement with them. And then on the other hand, as we are a public sector union, there's a different approach towards the state and to the negotiations with the state where there is not an open struggle going on, but rather like probably more like a reformist approach, which kind of maybe is interlinked to the question of structural change in this regard, that we are like our first or main structural challenge is to overcome neoliberalism, and especially the pandemic has shown how broken the relevant infrastructure is in the society. So I think we all tend to forget this whole question about I don't really know the English term, but this rate of how many people are infected right now and how many people are in the hospitals, and that the local administration is not in charge, is overworked, and they they are not capable anymore of tracking people, is basically a problem, especially which is has been created by neoliberalism, and so in this sense, this is this is all kind of that was in the early kind of month of the pandemic. That was quite clear that if we go in this direction, this will happen in a situation where the society is under pressure in the and these kind of institutions have to work and have to function. They fail because they are under resourced, and people are running away from these institutions because they can't stand it anymore. I mean, I think this is quite clear, and this is also like a situation where a lot of people know that we can't go on. That that we have to overcome these structural problems, or create a kind of a more social society, which also refers to the question of how society is run, and how are the rich being taxed, and where's the money basically coming from? Is it coming from the middle class and the workforce, or do we address the rich, which actually have gained a lot of money in the pandemic, especially kind of when you see these numbers? It's incredible how much money they made by this crisis situation, and but I can't. The main question is what we hoped actually was that these essential workforce they were put on in the focus, and that this kind of prevails when we are going to the question of how the society has been reorganized, and that it's quite clear that, for example, Germany is relying on migrant labor and women's labor, if you look at the care sector. But I think right now we still have the situation that people are really kind of there's a big, I don't know, desire for normality right now, and for going back to the situation that we had before the pandemic. So I think my hope, or our hope as an organization, is that we kind of recreate this sense of what is really important, which kind of work is actually important in the society, and then we are talking also. Then we have to take up the question of structures and system change.
Yes, on the one hand, I guess the pandemic laid bare that these are structural issues, and that you can't really fix them by just raising the salary a bit, or by having a one-time bonus payment for care workers. But at the same time, as you point out, but also as Amna said earlier, there's both from the top, as it were, from the elites, but to a certain extent also from the middle ground, this desire to return to the so-called normality that was part of the whole problem. I mean, that led into the crisis, or that and whose structure was partly to blame for how the pandemic played out. So that's a very kind of weird situation, almost schizophrenic, between, on the one hand, an awareness that there are these structural issues, and on the other hand, just the wish to return to some kind of tiny reformism that doesn't touch these structural issues. Amna, I mean, in your work, you have also highlighted this notion of non-reformist reforms as a possible trajectory for orienting emancipatory movements towards structural and radical change, but at the same time, so not postponing that radical change to a future revolutionary moment that might never come. Could you speak to this a bit?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Right. So to be clear, it's a little bit less that I'm advocating for non-reformist reforms, and more that in the United States, I think it's fair to say that in the last several years, social movements and social movement organizations on the left have been engaging in reform struggles and articulating a politics of non-reformist reform, which is to say it's less kind of about my point of view and more about where there's kind of militancy and analysis coming from different forms of grassroots organization that interests me here. And so you have this kind of articulation of the importance of non-reformist reforms across the left in the United States, and kind of the more classic democratic socialists of America or socialist point of view. There's a borrowing from a framework or frameworks developed by in a long line of Marxist and socialist kind of thinkers. Andre Gores tends to be the one who's cited most often in his work Strategy of Labor, where he articulates a non-reformist reform that strikes at the power of capital, that is a demand that's based not on the dictates of capital, but on the kind of the imagination and the possibility of fundamentally different political, economic, and social structures. And importantly, he emphasizes kind of the need of non-reformist reforms to come from and expand democratic power. So the power of the working class to kind of implement and demand self-determination of a sort. And then you kind of have this kind of parallel but intersecting prison abolitionist conception of non-reformist reforms, which is focused on reforms that don't legitimate but undermine and shrink the footprint, the legitimacy, and the resources at the disposal of the carceral state, so prisons and police. And of course, the mobilizations last summer against the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, where we saw kind of defund the police as being the primary, in a sense, the primary organic demand from the street, in a way that took many of us by surprise, even those of us who were studying left social movements and participating in them, is kind of a classic or now central example of a non-reformist reform, at least for those whose primary kind of radical horizon is rooted in prison abolition, which I should say, when you think about its origins, or its contemporary origins, of course, it's a long tradition in the writings and organizing of people like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Itself is a kind of Marxist and socialist politic, just with kind of different kind of emphasis on the centrality of prisons and police as kind of the forefront of the struggle. And so I think the question, the structural account of repression, yes, it's rooted in all the things that you mentioned at the outset, Robin, in terms of structures of global capital, including, I would say, transnational finance, legal structures, and nation state. And in the US, the reform kind of question has become important for the left in new ways. And so you both have this emphasis on non-reformist reform, and then you have also these electoral campaigns in a way that are also relatively new that we didn't see for many decades, in terms of course, classically Bernie Sanders' campaign for the presidency, but then also the so-called squad. So these more kind of left-wing, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez members of Congress, and then kind of cognates at the state and local level, people running out of the Democratic Socialists of America. So kind of a left electoral politic in a way, again, that we haven't seen in a long time. And on the one hand, I think this is all kind of like a great source of optimism. It has been for me. And on the other hand, I think many people think now, at least at the moment, we're in a moment we're arguably in a moment of demobilization on the left, and that some of this might be precisely that we've tilted too much toward electoralism and reformism and haven't spent enough time or haven't focused enough in the kinds of projects that Romin is articulating in terms of organizing, building organizations and kind of outside of the state institutional forms in a way that would make us less reactive and more kind of sustainable in building radical politics and building working class consciousness. I'm also hoping to kind of like pivot back to like the last question, because there were some things out of that I thought were really interesting can I do that now? Yeah, okay. So there were two really interesting things that came out, like in listening to everyone talk in response to the first question. The first, in response to what Manon was saying, it occurred to me, and maybe this is, not interesting, but it feels interesting to me. It occurred to me that I wonder to what extent, in some sense, are we experiencing a kind of generational struggle, right? So how much of this is that? So Manon, you were talking about what's happening at Harvard with the faculty who seems to have sexually harassed and assaulted students, and then the kind of faculty defense of him. Of course, after that letter came out with the faculty defense, then you had young people and students who filed a lawsuit and who on social media and on campus kind of challenged those faculty enough that they then recanted their letter to a certain extent and walked it back. Similarly, you're seeing graduate student organizing across the country in the United States. And even there was a viral video a couple of years ago that kind of articulated, and whether you're talking about the Green New Deal in the United States or Greta Thunberg, like kind of like young people saying on the question of the environment in particular, that, we are inheriting a mess that you created, and that, like the older people kind of don't understand it and are not willing to take the risks because you all essentially will die before this gets much worse. And then the second thing, which seemed really interesting to me, is and maybe it's because of who's in this panel, but it's kind of what is the role or the question of academia within emancipatory struggle? We were talking about, like Manon, you were talking about that, about the Harvard question, but I think a lot of, I don't know, in the United States, I've recently started to worry that as much as, of course, the social movements, the strikes, the rebellions that we're seeing are broad phenomenon that are encompassing many forms and spaces of life and organization. And it's important, and I think academics unquestionably have a role to play, but sometimes I feel like we are overly important in these conversations in a way that I think it's important to kind of think about. And of course, to the extent that we're here, I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about it, but I guess it makes me wonder how much we should talk more explicitly and directly about the role that we play in relation to these struggles, both on our campuses and in the cities that we live.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's probably one of the quite big differences. There's no risk of German academics being overly involved in struggles, I guess. It's quite the opposite. But still, the problem you point to is of course a very important one in terms of also just like, what's the role of the theorist, etc., in relation to the positions that are articulated within the struggle. Manon, I would like to ask you, because in the feminist movement, one could see both an example for how this question of sustainable organizing over time has been quite successfully addressed in a way, but also maybe an example for some of the risks of, for example, taking a reformist orientation in liberal feminism, or choosing for one or the other approach. And I mean, do you have a sense of what the history of the feminist movement could teach us for these questions that we've just started to discuss?
Yeah, I think it teaches us that it's complicated. No, but I think typically, as a feminist, it's interesting for me to see this whole agreement on capitalism being the source of oppressions, because of course, like I of course agree with this analysis and the importance of the appropriation of free labor to understand gender dynamics and the fruitfulness of materialist approaches. But I think what is complicated for feminists is that one of the core problem is individualism, and that individualism is both a very good thing for women and a very bad thing. That I think individualism is what has provided a framework for the emancipation of women in a certain way. What I mean by that is that if you think of people as individuals, then the question of knowing why women are not individuals became very salient. And so I think it's complicated because individualism is also what has been hurting women very much. And it was like in my work, for instance, I work on sexual consent, and it's very interesting for me to see how thinking in terms of consent has both been the way to recognize sexual agency for women and also to promote a vision of sexuality where men offer and want sex and women give in to men, and where sexuality is heterosexual and heteronormative. And so we're like this sort of two flips of the same coin. But I think also the problem is that all of these oppressions that we're talking about have to be considered as at an international level. But it is also very striking for me that when Romin and Amna talk, they're talking about two such different social formations. Like the unionization in the US is something so marginal, right? And so there is no social discourse. There is no, like I don't know, I just had kids. Like there is no maternity leave in the US or parental leave. Like when you think about this from a German perspective, it seems incomprehensible, right? Like the when you think of tipped workers whose like minimum wage at the federal level is something like $2 an hour. When we come from Europe, from the EU and from France and Germany in my case with those lenses to look at the US, there's something where I don't even know where to start. So I feel like the reform, it's also that things are so backwards that reformism is not even an option. When you look at the situation of the welfare state in Germany, you can think, okay, like we need to make progress. But when you think about the situation for workers and for working class women and people of color in the US, the situation is so bad that there is no, if you do gradual change, it's going to take 300 years. And so there's something so I think that creates a different, like a necessarily different way to look at things. But at the same time, I can only be, like, I'm very impressed by the importance of the international level in the diffusion of ideas. And I think the panel we're having right now is a very big testimony to this, that we've been reading each other's work and I don't know, like recently I was working on Beauvoir and her reception and her influences, and Beauvoir would have never understood women oppression the way she did without Du Bois and Richard Wright and African American thinkers. But also Fanon would have never thought of colonialism the way he did without Beauvoir's work. And so there's a sort of, and then Beauvoir's work was read by women in the South who really challenged some of her ideas and built theory with and against her. And I think at least at the international, there's something to be done at the international level in terms of theorizing, as long as this theorizing can be done with everyone and not about people without them, something like that. But I agree with what Amna was saying about the question of a generational struggle, but I do think that the core problem that we're all confronted with right now is the demobilization of a lot of people, and that it has social reasons, right? If people, I mean, in the US, if people have 3 jobs to survive, how do you want them to mobilize? And so there are very basic social needs that need to be addressed before the people can remobilize. I don't understand how you just have the time and the mental space if you're a single parent, if you're very poor, if you're like overwhelmed with medical bills. There's no way you can politically mobilize. So in that regard, I absolutely agree with the fact that capitalism is the first problem to address.
I very much agree with your observations concerning the differences between the European still welfare state, the US, and of course this also raises interesting question about, I mean, how to even come up with what Silke van Dyk mentioned, the idea of a global welfare state and global perspective on this. But I want to start the next round with first addressing an issue that has come up in the chat. That is that are some questions about what a reformist reform should be like, or non-reformist reforms should be like. So, I mean, as I take it, and I found it very interesting the way that Amna spelled it out and also spells it out in her articles. It is not just about abolishing the police instead of just reforming it or organizing anti-bias trainings. What I took from the discussion and your writing is that it aims at radical transformation, even if articulating this specific issue. And this seems to lead to a strategy that tries to analyze and articulate, I mean, in this case, how police or prison is part of the social order, and how policing is a way in which society treats certain matters that should be and could be treated otherwise. So this is what I took from like the radicalism implied in non-reformist reforms. That there's an attempt to change the structure, but even an attempt to, I mean, first of all, address how the structure is affected and what kind of causes we have to face and so on, which then leads to one of the questions that we wanted to discuss in this round. And this is the question about how, I mean, seen from the other side now, how those systems of oppression hang together. There was this famous statement that the Combahee River Collective came up with. They said, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. And this seems to be an articulation of, I mean, the attempt to get to the roots, I mean, to be radical in terms of getting to the roots. But at the same time, the CRC did reject the idea that there is one central form of oppression or the one vantage point for all emancipatory politics. So the question then would be how to conceptualize the relation between those systems of oppression. Are they just additive? Are they mutually enforcing? What is your take on this relation in terms, I mean, in order to come up with an idea of what structural issues we have to address, or what the structure that should be changed in order to be a non-reformist reformer, what this looks like. And again, we would like to this time we would like to start with Manon, and then would have Romin, Amna, and Silke to take over.
I mean, I think it sounds like to some extent, it's an old debate and a somewhat solved question that oppressions intersect in such a way that they're not additive and that their intersection creates specific forms of oppression. I take that to be the core idea of intersectionality, but I think it raises...
So, the question is it solved, or is it, I mean, some people say it's just some kind of a placeholder. I mean, this idea that there is this intersection and they do mutually enforce each other, and I mean,
but I agree with you that it's a sort, it looks like it's solved, and at the same time, having said that it's solved creates an enormous amount of issues, and I think I'm gonna sound like an old I'm going to sound like a boomer who's against what's going on when I really am not. But I think it's important to think about what it says about what is the subject of social struggles. Who can fight? Like for feminists, I think it's a very good question. Is there, if we take intersectionalism seriously, if we take seriously the fact that people should not be speaking from a place of privilege about other people that don't have the same privilege, that maybe every single subjective experience of oppression is different because everyone is differently located on like a sort of oppression map. The result is that there is a concern of, does it mean that we cannot talk about anything else than our own position, which would mean that no activism is possible in a certain way. And so I think that a lot of activists and theorists have responded to this and somewhat convincingly by the idea that it's not the problem that you cannot talk about feminism when you're a man, or cannot talk about the oppression of Black women when you're not a Black woman, but that you need to do the work, right? That like there are now feminist philosophers who identify as male, and it is possible and even sometimes great because they do the work of reading the other people. But I don't know. I mean, it's a question that I keep struggling with, I think, as an academic, because who can we talk about if we think that only people who are oppressed have hold a sort of truth about what oppression is? Because at the same time, if oppression really works, oppressed people can't talk, right? So it's the old question of Spivak, of like, can the subaltern speak? Can the subaltern be heard? I think philosophers were trying to think in terms of epistemic injustice, epistemic ignorance, like how some voices can be heard or can be uttered or not. But it, of course, raises issues about, is there something as the subject of feminism, the subject of anti-racist struggle, who has the legitimacy for representing anyone? Who can I talk for? Who can I talk with? And I think these are really not, it looks like I'm making a list of questions that we've heard so many times, but this is really a question of, for me in my work, it's like a concrete wall that I hit every single day. And I think, and in my teaching, I'm trying to show, because some students have it all figured out, that like male professors should not talk about X, and white professors should not talk about why, but I think it's much more complicated than that, and I don't have answers. And I think it's a big question typically is the question of false consciousness. So as some people know, like the idea of false consciousness is to say that oppressed people do not necessarily see that they're oppressed because ideology works so well that they don't think they're oppressed. But I think, as Romin showed in his work, sociologists have really had a big fight about this, about like what should we believe that the agents know about their own agency. And for us philosophers and for us and for me as a feminist, it's a very big question to know, like, how do you respect people's agency? How do you analyze people's autonomy with listening to what they say about their autonomy while knowing that they don't have the full picture, right? Like for me, when I talk about submission, there are really people who tell me, no, but I'm really not submissive. Like I was my partner, we have a purely egalitarian relationship. And then it just so happens that you see them or you want to see them and they tell you that they have to take care of the kids because their husband is away, but it's always in that direction. And so you're like, well, it looks like maybe you think you're not submitting in any, but at the same time, you want to take into account the fact that they think that they know better than you. And yeah, all of that to say that I don't really have an answer because I think it's a very difficult topic.
Thank you. So Romin, in your daily, I guess that in your daily work, you're confronted with the intersection of those systems and structures of oppression all the time. You have also argued, I remember that just a small remark in one of your articles, you said, it has also to be addressed on the level of representation. The unions, German unions who tended to be like all male, all white, also have to address the matter in terms of representation. But of course, this is not the end of the story. But how is it that you confront and address within your institution those matters and those intersections? How do you experience and address the like multiple oppressions that the people you work with and work for are confronted with? And what do you think about the connection or the underlying question, whether there is a connection and how to address this connection?
Yeah, you put it right. This is actually my main struggle. This is a question of representation and to basically to empower migrant members of our unions that they become more influential in the structures. Maybe it's a bit easy to interlink this process with the idea that if they become more influential, then also like the outcome of politics might also change, because they bring up other experiences, they fought other struggles, they definitely don't have a privileged background mostly, and in that sense that would also probably address the question that Silke also raised about the concept of the nation state, because when you have a transnational workforce, they have many influences and probably overcome this idea, which is, I think, was always a question in the labor movement, how the labor organizations are they basically organizing on the national level, or do they see the whole picture of the global labor movement, or of the global situation of workers? I kind of I know that the debate also like from the old days as being active in the autonomous left movement in Germany, and I think sometimes in these days now I also have the impression that it's too easy to put everyone in the box. Everyone is responsible for their own kind of identity, and then this is all brought together, and because this doesn't work in bigger social organizations, and I think it's good that it doesn't work. So, but on the other hand, it's still a struggle to come to the point where certain people shut up for a moment and let the other ones take the stage to become a broader perspective. And in what I probably, because you are a philosopher, so I can also put this idea or can present this idea. What my experience was when we had the situations in broader conferences, conventions of the unions, when there was a situation that people took the stage and brought up their own perspective, then there was a certain situation of relief, where I thought, okay, this is probably, so this could be the resource actually that we are hitting the new kind of, we are moving forward. We're not looking back anymore in that sense, or we take this into the consideration where people are coming from, but we are creating this kind of multicultural, multiracial, multi-identity space, which is also where people like queer people are taken into consideration, like lots of different identities. But this whole idea that we are actually following also in our organizations, that we are like anti-racist, democratic, open, I don't know, you name it, that a lot of people know that is that if we don't live it, then then these are just words, basically. And at the moment when we start when this whole range of identities is kind of tangible, then there might be a new kind of a new situation is coming up, where which is also like kind of, which is how we call it, not difficult all the time, I know, like as for everyone, but on the end there's no other way to go. And but especially for social organizations, it creates, it's authentic, and this is also like it's a resource. It's empowering for everyone in a way, when this kind of range of identities is being shown, not in a diversity or kind of shiny, glamorous way, but rather in a how you call it, in a way which is like basically which reflects the daily life of working class people, basically. I hope I could put it.
No, that was Amna and then Silke. Amna, maybe you want to take over from this.
Sure. I mean, I appreciated, Rahel, that you started with invoking the Kambahi River Collective. I think certainly kind of in some sense what we're all articulating and what we are seeing in a range of movements is the need for an intersectional radical politics. And at the same time, it's something that is being worked out in practice and through failure in kind of iterative form. And I think one of the really important things in the abolitionist tradition is this idea or of like the importance of embracing that we don't have the answers, but it's all kind of in the sense that Romin was suggesting in the practice. And so the work of kind of building intersectional analysis and movements and struggles is necessarily slow, even if we have a sense that it's urgent, and even if there are moments where there's great speed and momentum. And so I think one of the questions in thinking about struggle in intersectional ways is the question of who is the protagonist. And of course, from a classical Marxist perspective, the protagonist is the working class, but the identity of the working class is not something, as we all know, that self-executes. In the United States, for example, as I gestured at before, a lot of the labor struggles of the last several years have been in domains of care work, so by teachers and nurses and so on, and even domestic workers, where you have a lot of immigrant women and women of color and women and queer, gender, non-binary folks, etc. In the racial justice left, you often see this language that the protagonist at the kind of core constituency we should be concerned with is so-called directly impacted people. And that category too is something that doesn't kind of, like how you define it depends both on your political analysis and I think on your observations or your connection with where struggles and militancy is emerging. But I think either way, whether your politics are more oriented towards classic kind of revolutionary politics, or you are open to a path that embraces non-reformist reforms, one of the contradictions, of course, is this need for mass politics, because one of the really important things that I think distinguishes left politics from other forms of politics is precisely that we believe in the multitude and the people and the many. And so how to kind of take all of these different things that divide us, whether discursively or practically, and that are mobilized by elites in a way that allows us to build the kind of mass politics that it would take to meet, overcome, overthrow capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy is, I think, in some sense, the key question. And of course, we can't figure that out overnight. But of course, we know that, like all of the kind of major struggles of our day that you both have been framing throughout, whether it's struggles against prisons and police, the need for housing, the need to slow down extractivism and exploitation of human and non-human life, these are the things that link us together and that allow us to kind of that allow us to kind of struggle through this question of how to build solidarity. And I guess the last thing I just wanted to say is that, so this book just came out, Abolition Feminism Now by Angela Davis and others. It felt important to mention, it feels important to mention because one of the key arguments that Davis and the authors make is that the struggle for prison abolition is the struggle for feminism, and vice versa. And I think and of course, in some sense, you see this articulation of co-constituted struggle across the left. And so you also see, for example, through organizations like the Red Nation, this kind of insistence that indigenous politics is environmental politics, that fighting for indigenous sovereignty is a way to fight capitalism and colonialism. And so try to think about how these connections, not just in kind of in the abstract and the theory, but one of the things I appreciate in this book is that they root their articulation of abolition as feminism and feminism as abolition through engagement with concrete historical and contemporary campaigns and struggles against patriarchy and the carceral state. And so I think trying to figure out both kind of at that, kind of triangulating between these different scales of theory and practice seems necessary to make these connections.
So, Silke, I mean, when you were talking, I took the hint that you said we should, the left has made one mistake. It didn't thematize the social question from a global perspective, which might easily lead to the idea, okay, so it is some kind of anti-capitalist struggle, or, the way to the attempt to analyze and thematize the capitalist structure. At the same time, here in the chat, we already have a discussion about the question of how those issues hang together. And for example, Katja, who says those struggles shouldn't be, or maybe those struggles do not want to be reduced to being a form of anti-capitalist struggle. So I would like you to, I mean, since you hinted at those issues already, and to the kind of lack of an idea about how to reorganize economy and democracy, maybe you have an idea how this relates to, I mean, the overall question about the connection between those systems of oppression and the struggles.
I think that's a huge challenge to get class back in without letting it dominate all the other categories. And with regard to intersections and the various varieties of oppression, I'd like to come back to the two comments in the first round, because twice it was stated that the intersectionalist approach has won. And I wish that would be that was true, but empirically I'm much more skeptical if you really can say that. And I think that's that's obvious for a rather academic debate, but I think not even there. And I think there's a generational conflict too. We had conferences here where we had huge differences between the class fraction and those who came with other categories of oppression, and this was a line. It was heavily gendered, and it was a line according to age too, I would say, not to reduce it to that. And I think the second point is that it's not so easy with the intersectionalist approaches we do have. And I think that's why it is so important, as Amna said, to look at really concrete struggles who manage to combine different perspectives. But I think within many theoretical intersectionalist approaches, we have the problem that class is taken into account, but very often in terms of classism, of discrimination on the basis of class. But that's something completely different than a structuralist perspective on class as a basis of exploitation. And so we have to look twice whether or not class means that someone is discriminated for a certain class-related behavior, or if it really on the terms of economic exploitation. And I think there are so many questions open. We had this discussion whether or not the categories add up or if they are interdependent and so on. So I think intersectionalist approaches is a starting point, but it is not an answer to these huge problems. That's one thing. Another thing, I think because the Combahee River Collective was mentioned several times, and I think the very interesting point is that they took a very universalist stance. Rahel, you quoted them to say, when we do belong, everyone belongs. And it's very interesting. They intervened in the current discussions on identity politics rather critically, because from their perspective, there are many young, it might be a generational question too, there are many younger activists who lose this universalist perspective and are very happy to find themselves within the categories. And I thought that's interesting, that they, from their perspective, raised this universalist question. And I think that's a very, very good point, and not in that liberal sense, when universalism is claimed to be empirically true, but as a basis of radical social structure, to have universalism the aim. And so social struggles have the aim to realize a universalist perspective. So I think that's interesting too. And I think that's another point I thought I just saw it briefly within the chat. Is it a good idea to base social struggles on categories of identity who are the result of oppression and discrimination? And I always think that the perspectives of Stuart Hall, with his perspective of identity politics of first grade, people organize and cooperate on the basis of categories they are addressed in to fight back. And then his second perspective, and I think that's interesting to discuss about identity politics of a second grade. And this is a perspective to challenge or to override the categories and to look for a pluralist common. And I think that's an interesting perspective. And I think we should discuss why it is obviously so difficult to come from the first grade to the second grade, and how much pluralism is possible within this perspective. I don't know if it really answered your question, Rahel, with regard to the global anti-capitalist movements. But I make a point here for the moment.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I can really pick up right there, because I think that's an excellent challenge to ask. Well, how do we move from that probably necessary starting point with the concrete forms of oppression and their particular experiences to the articulation of a shared or common horizon of emancipation? And the question of solidarity was mentioned in the chat as well. So yes, we can't assume that there's some kind of guaranteed convergence of struggles, because somehow, once they recognize it all hangs together, it somehow magically flows in the right direction. But if at all, this is the outcome of very hard political work, of organizational work, and of the work of solidarity, essentially. And maybe we can start with Romin. I mean, so I think that this challenge to build solidarity across lines of division that partly result from these different starting points, but that are partly also introduced, exploited, and exaggerated for political purposes by right-wing parties, by the media, by certain moral panics. I mean, how do you deal, practically speaking, with this work of solidarity, with in the light of these two challenges, the kind of necessarily divergent starting points, but also the ways in which, also in the union sector in Germany, you have right-wing unions, right, which try to enter the field and sort of exploit these lines of division even more. So how do you deal with this?
Yeah, I mean that's that the right wing is not attacking the unions, well, they do attack us, but also like they kind of started a campaign to create their own alternative unions, taking over leftist critique on the union, like that the union is part of the management and they are they joined the side of the bosses and stuff, which is basically not always wrong, but I mean that's definitely not what the right wing what's going at the core of the right wing forces, but rather that they want to they create the base basically, and that they want to broaden their base and to move into something which was always part of the fascist movement, like kind of having a social base within the workforce and within the workers movement. It's interlinked with like concepts of national sovereignty and these kind of things. Yeah, well, what we do is like as we do their we follow the whole thing. We educate our members. We talk about our own how you call it, like demands or progress that we have made, which would be destroyed by these kind of movements. For example, like the what I was talking about, the right to vote, for example, is a good thing, because if we look at the elections within the companies for workers' council, everyone is, for example, has the right to vote, where in the national elections, that is not the case. So at that point, we show people what has been already achieved by worker struggles and by union struggles, which is actually helping everyone, or everyone is benefiting from these kind of rights. What we also where basically my union is also more open to, other unions are a bit more hesitate, is to join forces with social movements regarding our struggles. For example, we have a collaboration with Fridays for Future regarding the question of climate change, because we say climate change needs also, like, it's quite clear that the answer to climate change needs like good public transport, convenient public transport, which is also like combined to the question of how people who are basically working in these kind of companies are being paid, how are their working hours, how they can combine their life with their family life, because they work like in shifts or even in the night, and these kind of questions. So these are things where you see when you address these questions from below, and also like start dealing with these movements, or working together with these movements. Our impression is that the right wing forces they don't get ground on these questions, when these questions are addressed in this way, that it's quite clear that we have to consider every kind of interest, but also we are helping each other, like social movements are helping the workers, and vice versa, and this is probably these are probably examples where we are trying, which is under pressure. It's not that every Verdi member, for example, is a big fan of Fridays for Future. We have also like different opinions on these questions, but I think this is more, people become more how you call it. It's more clear what these movements are standing for. Is not just an image in the media, but rather it's like concrete people that you can talk to, and you can discuss with them and have an exchange. I mean, my impression is right now that the I'm not quite sure about how this whole debate about the question of the now I'm really struggling, like the word, the German word is Impfpflicht.
Yeah, vaccination mandate.
Yeah, the mandate, right? The vaccination mandate. What this might bring up, as we have seen in Canada, as we have seen also like in other, like in the US. I just read that in New York that 1,500 public workers, mostly policemen, I think, were like dismissed. That could be, this is like in a situation right now where also like the right wing is kind of taking over our like the union agenda against exclusion, against discrimination, against these kind of like core fundamental values of union or of union organizations. Now they are the ones who are defending workers who don't want to become vaccinated, and I doubted that it would be like a huge thing, because in the long run they don't have the experience to organize and on the workers on the company level or on the work level. But we won't know how these kind of fractions will play out in the long run. And this is like also like kind of this is a situation which is like kind of, I think that was also part of the discussion, that lots of these kind of trajectories can't really be. It's difficult to kind of have an analysis of how this will be played out in the long run.
Thanks. I mean, so one of the main challenges seems to be to counter this, let's say, right-wing agenda of portraying struggles for emancipation as kind of win-lose situations, so that you have to be worried about that struggle because it means that your situation will deteriorate, and we have to defend ourselves against that, which on the one hand seems to make some sense, because I mean, if social structures are also about the allocation of relative privileges to positions that might very much be involved, but on the other hand, there's a long tradition of challenging this kind of zero-sum vision of emancipation from Du Bois, talking about the need for transnational labor, solidarity against kind of strategies of racialized division, or de Beauvoir. I mean, saying that, well, I mean, overcoming the patriarchy is also, I mean, to put it very bluntly and simply, I mean, is also something that men should be interested in. Manon, I mean, could you speak a bit about that? Because I mean, feminism is one of the movements that has often been portrayed in this way, and this has met with these forms of backlash, from men who think that now it's their time to be dominated or whatever, and these fantasies. But at the same time, there have been these attempts from women feminist movements to address the need for such an encompassing emancipatory perspective as well.
So I think, I mean, there's no doubt for me that feminism would work better if men were part of it, but I think also anti-class oppression struggles would work better if the bosses were part of it. But the problem is that I'm not sure. I'm sure some men have really no interest in joining the feminist struggle because they have too much to lose. But I also think, so that's also, in a way, that's a big question I've asked myself about sexual consent, because I think that if we have this sort of, if we buy into this view that one of the things that men are interested in is having sex with women, which I think is in itself a sort of sexist, reducing views of what men can consider joyful in their lives. I'm not sure that men are the types of being who are obsessed with just having the maximum of sex with women at all times. But even if we were to think that, there would be an argument to be made that with a more egalitarian world, they would probably have better sex, because men don't have very good sex under patriarchy. But I was very bothered with this argument because, of course, I don't want to tell men, join us on the feminist struggle so that you can get better laid. Like that seems to be the worst possible feminist argument, but I do think that there are ways to look at how fighting for a more just world is better for everyone, and it's not just a sort of a Kantian feeling that you've done the right thing, but that I think since we're theoretically in Germany, I think, for instance, men would benefit, and some men do benefit, in having more gender egalitarian views because that gives them the joy of being parents. I think in Germany, the way a big spot of male privilege has been not taking care of kids, but taking care of kids is also something that can be very joyful when it's not something that prevents you from doing anything else that you might pursue. And so I think this reference to children is also interesting for me because about this question of privilege, because I had this very just like anecdotal experience of talking about my work both in France, in the US, and in Germany. And so when you talk about female submission or women's submission to men in heterosexual relationships, first from France, you focus on how the norms of sexiness and beauty, etc., oppress women. And a lot of German women who read this tell you, well, we don't have to worry about this. Like, we can do whatever we want with our bodies. Like, the diet culture is way less strong. The fact that the social space is saturated with seduction is way less so the case in Germany on average than in France. But then my response to those Germans who've objected this to me is to say, well, yes, but in France you have schools, you can leave your kids at school until 6 p.m. So no one is asking you to choose between having kids and having a job if your job is what you want to do. And so when we move to motherhood, then it becomes very clear that this is a completely different locus of oppression for women in Germany. And then you talk in the US, and a lot of women have this sort of very capitalist, liberal idea that like you need to lean in and you can have it all, and you just need to work really hard. And then you have this question of how submission is at the core of American racism, like how Asian women are a victim of a racism because they're seen as the perfect submissive women, and this is enforced on them. But on the other hand, African American women are really victims of racism because they're seen as not submissive and as not playing the game of a certain idea of femininity. So all of this to say that even inside a sort of form of structural oppression, you have people who have privileges. Like French women are privileged compared to German women with regards to motherhood. German women are privileged compared to French women with regards to imperatives on their body and the availability of their body for the sexual conquest of men. But I think this is a good argument to take a step back from the privilege framework to think in to put back a vocabulary of justice and political imperatives and even moral imperatives in the discourse, that in a way thinking in terms of privilege has a form of utilitarianism in the background at all times, that you should want things that will maximize your own utility. And I think maybe this is really what is the core belief that we all need to fight in the fights against all forms of oppression, is to say, is it really the case that we should want to be constantly as high as we can on the hierarchy so that we maximize our gains, we maximize our available time. We maximize our recognition. We maximize. So this, I think, this vocabulary of privilege can be used to highlight this obsession of maximization that we have, I feel, these days, and that might be at the core of our problems.
Yeah, thanks. We're nearing the end of our conversation, but I would like to ask Silke if she has some final reflections on this question about the perspective. I mean, you talked briefly about the need for a kind of universalist vision. I don't know if you want to pick this up or any other aspect really that you want to close on with.
I'd like to pick up the perspective on privileges, because I think we have to talk about that when we talk about the social divisions and struggles, because I think very often, I think, in left-wing movements, it's this idea all good things go together, and there might be struggles within the movements and contradictions. We see them with regard to the climate change and the social question, and it is a fact that people who are rather poor and economically not privileged in Germany are privileged in a global sense and do have a footprint which exceeds those of others and so on. So we always have to take into account that privilege might be relative without negating it in a certain context, and privileges are disputed. In certain contexts, some privileges might be more important than others. So I think we always, there is this notion of multitude or solidarity across all divisions, but we can only talk about what divisions can be crossed when we talk where are really disputes and contradictions and interests. And I think with regard to struggles for economic rights and economic dimensions, we will have huge disputes with regard to climate change and the climate dimension. That's one thing. The other thing with regard to privilege, I think it was a huge step within social movements against oppression to bring in this perspective, because it, I think it sensitized for the structural dimension of oppression, that I don't have to be consciously and willingly racist or sexist in order to profit or benefit from the structural conditions of my existence. And I think that was a huge steps within movements to understand that racism and sexism and other forms of oppression have this structural dimension of privilege, even though I don't like the privilege. And I think that was really very important. But now, sometimes, I think the perspective on privilege is a little bit overstretched, because I think if we want to have broad mass movements against oppression, we do have to accept that even people who are privileged in some sense can be in solidarity with those oppressed. And I think sometimes there is this tendency that it has to be a first-hand experience in order to be a true speaker person for this struggle or for this fight. And I think there might be historical conditions where this is the case. For example, when the Convergence River Collective, when they wrote their statements, their voice or this perspective was completely absent from the public debate. But I think now we are in another, it's decades since then, in some perspective, and that's good, and that's a success of social movements. I can read about them, I can hear them, even though it's not my own position. And I think we do, for progressive movements, the first-hand experience is important. I don't want to deny that, but we have to go a step further and to discuss about solidarity from a perspective who does not have the first-hand experience. And I think this perspective of solidarity should not disappear behind movements that are very, very strong on this first-hand experience as true basis of resistance.
Thank you. Amna, would you like to add some final reflections following up on Silke's comments?
I guess the only thing I would add to this incredibly rich conversation is, in my remarks before, I raised this question of who is the protagonist. How do we think of the working class, for example? And now we're kind of like, in some sense, on the other side of it, with this question of who is the opposition, right? Because one of the if you embrace an intersectional framework, whether you're thinking about patriarchy and you think, the opposition is men, or in some sense, or you're focused on an anti-capitalist or some kind of integrated analysis, the question of who is the opposition and how do we relate to them? To what extent is reform or persuasion the tool to convince them that, join our fight because there's benefits for you too, versus taking on a more oppositional approach, I think are all strategic questions that, can kind of be meditated on through the lens of whether reform or revolution is the mode of response. But I think, but it seems important, and it seems like in some sense some fundamental distinction between liberal and left approaches to not be settled or complacent with the idea that it is in the domain of discourse and persuasion that we're going to win these struggles.
Thank you so much. So we're at the end of this conversation. I mean, it's obvious that these were huge questions, and although I think we did bring out their complexity and the way in which they hang together, we obviously didn't address them in all detail. But I hope we can continue this conversation at some future point. This was incredibly rich, as Amna said, and very fascinating, and I have learned a lot. So I hope that everyone who participated enjoyed it. Thanks so much to our panelists for their generosity and for sharing your perspectives. I thought there was convergence here, at least in terms of theoretical and also politically oriented working together. So that's in itself very satisfying and promising. And I hope some of that optimism might also be redeemed in practice, hopefully one day. Thanks from our side to everyone who participated, and hope to see you all again soon. Bye-bye.